Welcome back to XRP Unfiltered, and I hope everyone is doing well today. The topic we're covering now is one of the most significant conversations we've had in quite some time because it directly addresses a question that nearly every XRP holder continues to ask, which is where exactly we are within the current market cycle and what truly deserves our attention at this stage, not based on feelings, not based on online narratives, but grounded in what credible market participants and institutional decision-makers are actually communicating. Over the last several days, two individuals from very different segments of the financial ecosystem have shared perspectives on the state of the crypto market, XRP's role within it, and what could potentially develop in the near future, with one being a widely recognized market strategist, often referenced within traditional finance circles, and the other being the chief executive of a regulated ETF provider who has been actively involved in the creation of digital asset-related investment products. And when figures operating at this level speak about markets, they are not engaging in speculation, but rather discussing market structure, adoption pathways, and risk assessment frameworks. And regardless of whether one agrees with their conclusions, understanding how they are interpreting the current environment is valuable. Before addressing their remarks directly, it's important to share something that occurred earlier today when I received a message from the CEO of a crypto-focused company outside of the XRP ecosystem that included a pre-recorded video centered on preparing for an extended bear market, which I did not finish watching, not due to a lack of credibility on their part, but because the fundamental assumptions driving the message conflicted with what I've been observing unfold in real time, as the argument relied heavily on the idea that we are entering another predictable 4-year cycle dictated by Bitcoin mining dynamics and recurring speculative behavior. A framework that may have been valid when crypto largely existed outside institutional involvement, but is increasingly difficult to defend in today's market. The environment we're operating in now is fundamentally different from what existed in 2017, or even 2021, as regulatory clarity is approaching. Institutional infrastructure continues to expand, and adoption discussions have shifted from theoretical conversations to practical implementation, highlighted by Ripple's recent acquisition of G Treasury, a firm connected to more than 13,000 financial institutions, a development that underscores how certain segments of this market are moving on a cadence that no longer aligns with traditional retail-driven cycles. This is why I consistently encourage viewers to broaden their information sources rather than relying on a single perspective, including mine, by following a range of analysts, economists, and builders, particularly those with backgrounds in traditional finance, because the picture becomes far more complete when multiple interpretations of the same data are considered, and ultimately, any long-term thesis should be rooted in research rather than repetition, especially when evaluating adoption potential, which requires observing what institutions are actually doing rather than what is claimed online. That means paying attention to how leadership teams allocate time and capital, how organizations approach blockchain integration, which networks they experiment with, which ledgers they evaluate, and which technologies align with their internal systems, and repeatedly XRP emerges in these discussions due to its clear utility focused on efficient value transfer at scale, an adoption model driven by functionality rather than speculation, which is central to why the comments being discussed today are meaningful. The market is currently experiencing tension between short-term bearish sentiment and longer-term structural developments, and while anyone can analyze charts and make claims based on price movement, those building ETFs, evaluating settlement infrastructure, or assessing operational readiness are focused on a different set of indicators altogether, which is precisely why the perspectives of these two professionals deserve attention, as they are not offering guarantees, but interpreting signs of structural transition that may no longer conform to the traditional 4-year cycle narrative many still rely on. When examining why so many participants default to the idea of repeating cycles, it becomes clear this expectation is rooted in historical precedent rather than the current market framework, as early crypto cycles were driven by Bitcoin halving events and retail behavior in an environment devoid of regulated ETFs, institutional custody, treasury-level integrations, or meaningful participation from legacy financial infrastructure. making speculation the dominant force, which naturally moves in waves, whereas today's market is colliding with regulatory progress, institutional capital channels, expanding liquidity products, and early-stage utility adoption, meaning the old model is no longer sufficient to fully explain where we are. Consider the recently completed Ripple and G Treasury integration, which involves a company embedded within thousands of financial institutions, a development that clearly does not align with typical retail cycle behavior, as banks and treasury management firms do not adjust their strategies around four-year Bitcoin narratives, but instead act when regulatory clarity emerges, efficiency gains become quantifiable, and technologies align with established operational systems, making the insights from experienced market professionals especially relevant. When ETF executives or macro strategists suggest the coming weeks may represent an inflection point, they are not reacting emotionally but analyzing liquidity conditions, cross-asset correlations, regulatory developments, and capital allocation trends, drawing from careers spent tracking institutional money rather than social media charts. And while none of this guarantees a specific outcome, it explains why their comments matter, as they are responding to observable shifts beneath the surface that suggest the market is transitioning away from a purely speculative phase. Another overlooked aspect is how institutions conceptualize blockchain adoption, as when large enterprises commit resources to distributed ledger exploration, it reflects strategic planning rather than sentiment. Since organizations do not dedicate multi-year development cycles to passing trends, but to solutions that improve settlement efficiency, liquidity management, transparency, or compliance automation, which explains why XRP continues to surface in institutional contexts due to its alignment with operational requirements, like speed, finality, throughput, and low friction, as functionality outweighs popularity when selecting settlement technology. The behavioral contrast between retail participants and institutions further reinforces this, with retail seeking patterns and narratives while institutions focus on mechanisms and infrastructure readiness, evaluating whether an asset fits into future settlement rails rather than reacting to short-term price movement, meaning strategists' comments should not be interpreted as price forecasts, but as assessments of how evolving regulatory and liquidity conditions may alter market behavior over time. As regulatory frameworks advance, ETF offerings expand, and enterprise adoption progresses, the predictive value of rigid cycle models diminishes, not because cycles vanish, but because maturation alters behavior, and when professionals within traditional finance adjust their analytical frameworks, it warrants attention given the indicators they monitor often remain invisible to retail observers. To understand why confidence around structural change is growing, it's necessary to look beneath surface narratives and recognize that markets shift due to evolving conditions rather than opinions, with the expansion of regulated ETF products serving as a prime example, as dozens of crypto-related ETFs are positioned for launch, signaling institutional expectations of digital assets becoming normalized portfolio components, which in turn reshapes liquidity behavior, volatility dynamics, and market depth. Alongside this, banks and financial service providers are preparing for regulatory clarity not as a speculative bet, but as an operational necessity, building systems in anticipation of compliance rather than price movement, which brings XRP's relevance into sharper focus given its design for high-volume settlement rather than retail speculation. When experts discuss XRP adoption, they are not predicting explosive price action, but acknowledging its structural positioning for integration once regulatory clarity is established, as infrastructure adoption occurs gradually before scaling, and institutional preparation often remains behind closed doors until formal activation becomes possible. Traditional finance discourse reflects this reality through its focus on rails, throughput, liquidity corridors, and readiness rather than market hype, underscoring why analysts are questioning outdated cycle assumptions as ETFs remove supply, liquidity enters through regulated channels, and blockchain systems become embedded within financial plumbing, shifting market behavior toward integration with the broader financial system. This institutional lens explains why XRP is discussed in precise, utility-driven terms by respected figures who evaluate readiness for real-world deployment rather than daily price performance, as reflected in comments framing XRP as a functional component of emerging financial architecture already being prepared for use behind the scenes. Institutional adoption does not require public spectacle, as banks and payment providers conduct extensive testing privately until regulatory conditions permit activation, and remarks about the scale of preparation reflect how slowly large systems move rather than exaggeration. Discussions around legislation like the Clarity Act highlight this process, as regulatory definition enables activation of infrastructure already built, reinforcing why banks prioritize networks that meet operational requirements over online popularity, and why XRP continues to be monitored, tested, and integrated by institutions seeking reliable settlement solutions. Observations about volatility reduction through regulated products align with historical patterns across asset classes, where structured participation dampens emotional trading over time, reinforcing the idea that as institutional involvement grows, markets become increasingly driven by structural demand rather than narratives. Ripple's disciplined approach to building relationships across thousands of institutions further supports this, as such efforts reflect long-term integration planning rather than speculation, lending credibility to assessments from ETF professionals whose role is to evaluate suitability rather than promote hype. When considering expert commentary, institutional behavior, regulatory context, and infrastructure development together, it becomes evident why the conversation around XRP feels different, not due to guaranteed outcomes, but because the conditions shaping the market no longer mirror previous cycles. Both the strategist and ETF executive approached the topic from different angles, yet conveyed a similar message, that the crypto market is maturing into a regulated, interconnected component of global finance, reducing the influence of behavioral patterns that once dominated retail-driven eras. The persistence of four-year cycle thinking reflects historical context rather than current structure. And as regulated custodians, ETFs, banks, and treasury firms integrate blockchain solutions, the market transitions towards structural adoption. Professional analysts view cycles as diminishing behavioral patterns rather than immutable laws, while ETF executives discussing XRP focus on integration readiness rather than price speculation, acknowledging signals most retail participants never see, including internal institutional discussions and alignment between token design and settlement needs. Regulatory clarity provides the legal foundation institutions require to deploy systems at scale, explaining why pilot programs focus on assets designed for liquidity optimization, further reinforcing the importance of analytical rather than emotional engagement with the market. Being bullish or bearish alone is not a strategy, and many extended bear market calls rely on outdated frameworks, just as expectations of instant transformation misunderstand institutional timelines, with a balanced approach requiring awareness of structural progress, patience, and avoidance of extremes. Long-term adoption, if it continues, will unfold unevenly, shaped by regulation, infrastructure, demand, and usability, which is why discussions like this aim to provide insight into how professionals interpret signals rather than predict outcomes. You don't need to agree with every expert, but expanding perspective beyond daily sentiment strengthens decision-making. And if this discussion added value, feel free to share your thoughts below regarding what stood out or challenged your assumptions, as engagement helps broaden understanding beyond surface-level narratives. Thanks for watching Journey to XRP. Stay analytical, stay focused, and continue evaluating developments with patience and clarity. And remember, this content is for educational purposes only, not financial advice, so always conduct your own research before making investment decisions.